our first graph for analyzing graphs that are in the news comes from an article about Vancouver house prices. For each graph that we look at, we're going to be answering the following questions. What is the source of the graph? So the organization or website you found it on and the people who made the graph. We're going to describe the graph in terms of increasing, decreasing sort of language, maximums and minimums. The story that the graph tells, this is like our explanation of the graph in 2 or 3 sentences. And then we're going to try to calculate a rate of change for at least one section of the graph. And then finally, is there anything misleading that maybe is misleading about the graph that is done intentionally or unintentionally that might influence how the graph looks or what it might make the reader think. So here's the graph that I found. It comes from the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver. So the source of the graph, it comes from an article which I have in quotes here by Carissa Wilson at news.buzzbuzzhome.com. So because there's multiple lines on this graph, I'm going to focus on just the blue line, which says detached. That means a regular house that isn't attached to any other building. So it doesn't include apartments or condos that are part of a bigger complex. So it's just regular detached homes. So let's describe the graph in terms of increasing and decreasing trends. So to start with, there's a slow increase until the 90s, till the 1990s. So that's describing this part of the graph here. And then it looks like it levels off for a number of years. So constant between 1995 to about 2002, and then starting after 2003, prices increase, and I'm going to describe the rate as quickly because it's a much steeper slope there. So prices increase quickly. So now we could get to maximums and minimums. And on this bumpy graph, there's a lot of local maximums and minimums. So you can see that there's a little peak here and here. I'm going to describe this as sort of a important maximum. And then again, you can see that there's other little maximums as we go along, but they come along these bigger trends. So I'll say a short maximum. I'll describe this one here in around 95, around 1995. And then really there's another maximum in the most recent times here. Highest maximum in most recent years. And again, there's little tiny minimums we could describe, but I think for this graph it doesn't really make sense to describe the minimums because they don't stand out too much and they don't last very long. So what story does the graph tell? Well, I think to me it looks like house prices were increasing slowly and pretty stable up until about this point in 2002 or 2003, and then they really started to take off. So that's what I'm going to describe in 2 sentences here. House prices increased slowly, which is expected to happen. So there's nothing out of the ordinary about a slow increase in house prices from the 1970s, which is the beginning of our graph, to 2002, and beginning in 2003 prices have increased rapidly. So I would say that that's the general story that the graph is telling. Because we've spent so much time describing or going into the detail of how to calculate a rate of change, I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly, and if you need to review those skills, please go back to those previous lessons. So just as an example of how I would find a spot to calculate a rate of change, I thought that it looked like there was a pretty interesting rate of change between 2009 and 2017. So that would be between about here and here, drawing a line of best fit. It looks something like that. And so I thought that that looked like a pretty interesting rate of change that I could calculate. So that would be a run of, so let me just write this clearly. So from 2009 to 2017. There's a run there. I'm going to use subtraction of 8 years. And the rise, I'll have to get from estimating the y values along the line of best fit. And so the rise, I thought it looked like the maximum was around, in 2017, was around $1,750,000 for an average house in Vancouver. And beginning in 2009, it looked like it was, the average price was around $800,000. So that gave me a rise of about $950,000. And so my rate of change is going to be equal to the rise over the run, or 950,000 divided by 8 years. That's a total of $118,750 per year. So that's the rate of increase of average house prices over that 8-year stretch. Finally, is there anything misleading about the graph? Explain why or what features make it a good and fair graph. And I think after spending some time with this graph, I think it's a totally fair graph. I think it's fair. And now why I think it's fair? Well, to start, it uses the entire graph, uses whole graph. So it doesn't shrink the y-axis or do anything weird with the y-axis values there. It starts at 0, doesn't have to, but I think it's appropriate since the values start quite low. So starts at 0 and it's not trying to shrink a little change or we should say to spread out a little change to make it look bigger. So starts at 0 on y-axis. And I think this is really important, has a long time scale for context, which is that if they just showed us this one little stretch here starting after about 2003 and just showed us everything left of 2003, the rapidly increasing house prices would look totally normal. But by giving us instead the context of everything since the late 70s, we can sort of see how this recent rapid increase is a new development for us.